Mrs. Concord and her older daughter Helen were sitting in their living room, sewing and talking and trying to keep warm. Helen had just put down the stockings she had been mending and walked over to the French doors that opened out onto the garden. "I wish spring would hurry up and get here," she was saying when the doorbell rang. "Good Lord," Mrs. Concord said, "if that's company. The rug's all covered with loose threads." She leaned over in her chair and began to gather up the odds and ends of material around her as Helen went to answer the door. She opened it and stood smiling, while the woman outside held out a hand and began to talk rapidly. "You're Helen? I'm Mrs. Fredman," she said. "I hope you won't think I'm just breaking in on you, but I have been so anxious to meet you and your mother." "How do you do?" Helen said. "Won't you come in?" She opened the door wider, and Mrs. Fredman stepped in. She was small and dark and wearing a very smart leopard coat. "Is your mother home?" she asked Helen, just as Mrs. Concord came out of the living room. "I'm Mrs. Concord," Helen's mother said. "I'm Mrs. Fredman," Mrs. Fredman said. "Bob Fredman's mother." "Bob Fredman," Mrs. Concord repeated. Mrs. Fredman smiled apologetically. "I thought surely your boy would have mentioned Bobby," she said. "Of course he has," Helen said suddenly. "He's the one Charlie's always writing about, Mother. It's so hard to make a connection," she said to Mrs. Fredman, "because Charlie seems so far away." Mrs. Concord was nodding. "Of course," she said. "Won't you come in and sit down?" Mrs. Fredman followed the Concords into the living room and sat in one of the chairs not filled with sewing. Mrs. Concord waved her hand at the room. "It makes such a mess," she said, "but every now and then, Helen and I just get to work and make things. These are kitchen curtains," she added, picking up the material she had been working on. "They're very nice," Mrs. Fredman said politely. "Well, tell us about your son," Mrs. Concord went on. "I'm amazed that I didn't recognize the name right away, but somehow I associate Bob Fredman with Charles and the Army, and it seemed strange to have his mother here in town." Mrs. Fredman laughed. "That's just about the way I felt," she said. "Bobby wrote me that his friend's mother lived here only a few blocks from us, and said, 'Why didn't I drop in and say hello?' I'm so glad you did," Mrs. Concord said. "I guess we know about as much about Bob as you do by now," Helen said. "Charlie's always writing about him." Mrs. Fredman opened her purse. "I even have a letter from Charlie," she said. "I thought you'd like to take a look at it." "Charles wrote you?" Mrs. Concord asked. "Just a note. He likes the pipe tobacco I send Bobby," Mrs. Fredman explained. "And I put a tin of it in for him the last time I sent Bobby a package." She handed the letter to Mrs. Concord and said to Helen, "I imagine I could tell you all about yourselves. Bobby said so much about all of you." "Well," Helen said, "I know that Bob got you a Japanese sword for Christmas. 7 Bat must have looked lovely under the tree. Charlie helped him buy it from the boy that had it. Did you hear about that? And how they almost had a fight with the boy?" "Bobby almost had a fight," Mrs. Fredman said. "Charlie was smart and stayed out of it." "No, we heard it that Charlie was the one who got in trouble," Helen said. She and Mrs. Fredman laughed. "Maybe we shouldn't compare notes," Mrs. Fredman said. "They don't seem to stick together on their stories." She turned to Mrs. Concord, who had finished the letter and handed it to Helen. "I was just telling your daughter how many complimentary things I've heard about you." "We've heard a lot about you, too," Mrs. Concord said. "Charlie showed Bob a picture of you and your 2 daughters. The younger one's Nancy, isn't it?" "Nancy, yes," Mrs. Concord said. "Well, Charlie certainly thinks a lot of his family," Mrs. Fredman said. "Wasn't he nice to write me?" she asked Helen. "That tobacco must be good," Helen said. She hesitated for a minute and handed the letter back to Mrs. Fredman, who put it in her purse. "I'd love to meet Charlie sometime," Mrs. Fredman said. "It seems as though I know him so well." "I'm sure he'll want to meet you when he comes back," Mrs. Concord said. "I hope it won't be long now," Mrs. Fredman said. All three were silent for a minute, and then Mrs. Fredman went on with animation. It seems so strange that we've been living in the same town, and it took our boys so far away to introduce us. This is a very hard town to get acquainted in, Mrs. Concord said. Have you lived here long? Mrs. Fredman smiled apologetically. Of course I know of your husband, she added. My sister's children are in your husband's high school, and they speak so highly of him. Really? Mrs. Concord said. My husband has lived here all his life. I came here from the West when I was married. Then it hasn't been hard for you to get settled and make friends, Mrs. Fredman said. No, I never had much trouble, Mrs. Concord said. Of course, most of our friends are people who went to school with my husband. I'm sorry Bobby never got a chance to study under Mr. Concord, Mrs. Fredman said. Well, she rose. I have certainly enjoyed meeting you at last. I'm so glad you came over, Mrs. Concord said. It's like having a letter from Charles. And I know how welcome a letter can be, the way I wait for Bobby's, Mrs. Fredman said. She and Mrs. Concord started for the door, and Helen got up and followed them. My husband is very much interested in Charlie, you know, ever since he found out that Charlie was studying law when he went into the army. Your husband is a lawyer? Mrs. Concord asked. He's the Freedman of Grunewald, Freedman and White, Mrs. Fredman said. When Charlie is ready to start out for himself, perhaps my husband could find a place for him. That's awfully kind of you, Mrs. Concord said. Charles will be so sorry when I tell him. You see, it's always been sort of arranged that he'd go in with Charles Satterthwaite, my husband's oldest friend, Satterthwaite and Harris. I believe Mr. Fredman knows the firm, Mrs. Fredman said. A fine old firm, Mrs. Concord said. Mr. Concord's grandfather used to be a partner. Give Bob our best regards when you write him, Helen said. I will, Mrs. Fredman said. I'll tell him all about meeting you. It's been very nice, she said, holding out her hand to Mrs. Concord. I've enjoyed it, Mrs. Concord said. Tell Charlie I'll send him some more tobacco, Mrs. Fredman said to Helen. I certainly will, Helen said. Well, goodbye then, Mrs. Fredman said. Goodbye, Mrs. Concord said.